Thanks for being here, y'all. And to kick things off, I'm going to let Tom give you a little bit of background about his amazing journey.
Cool. Thanks, Amber. Cool. So, yeah, I'm originally from India. I grew up there. I fell in love with films, and that's where it all started. So I chased my dream, went to film school in Prague, was able to work with some really good filmmakers in India, worked on those blockbusters, Three Idiots, Carry On Munna Bhai, even had a film that was nominated for India's entry to the Oscars. And years later, a different path opened up with me being part of the Unreal Virtual Production Fellowship. And that was the path to virtual production. And that led me to ETC, where we did this project called Fathead that I call Fellowship 2.0. And we're going to share some of the learnings from that. So with that, I hand to Amber.
Awesome. Yeah, so just a little bit about myself. I work for Intel. We participated in this project from a practical research standpoint and really wanting to deep dive into what today's technology challenges are, particularly in a bleeding edge area like virtual production and how that might end up waterfalling down into other computing and need states. My background is I'm a traditionally trained industrial designer. I love to build things, kit bash stuff together. And I've been fortunate enough that in my career over the past decade, I've been lucky to work with some of the largest design teams in the world. And so a lot of my background is around researching how people are working and what is it that we need to do to build an environment that is more joyful and instinctual in order for them to create in a digital environment. And yeah, so a word about Fathead. That's enough about me. This was an amazing thing that ETC does where every year they have something called the Innovation Award, and companies are allowed to join in by saying, hey, this is an area that I want to investigate. I can put prototypes, I can put technology, and a bunch of other technology companies come together on this neutral ground, which is phenomenal because you have a mind share that normally you'd sit at the table with guns drawn over NDAs and legal this and legal that. And so it really allows a lot of these sort of think tank, want to problem solve types, such as myself and Tom and all the great folks at ATC to come together and just work on things. So the Innovation Award is a once yearly award that goes to a female or BIPOC graduate student. And this year we awarded it to a gentleman named C. Craig. And his film was Fathead. So everything that we're going to be talking to you about today is from the aspect of the fact that we actually did and shot and did the entire process of building a virtual production and shooting it. And some aspects that we're going to talk to you about this in this presentation today is just sort of like three key elements that we want to call out from that creative pipeline standpoint, and to also vet that today's talk is more focused on the pre-production of prepping for the on-site shooting, and then later on today, our talk at 1:45 will address the production stage of all the technology that we use, et cetera, et cetera. But these core things are that, a shake up to the traditional pipeline really needs to happen. It's outdated and it has some real serious downsides. The other aspect is that virtual production techniques, they're really useful not just for virtual production. And that the collaboration tools, a lot of us kind of talk more and more and more about collaboration, but the more technical and intensive these digital experiences or capabilities are, the more intense it is that different professionals from different backgrounds and different teams have to collaborate. So those tools are going to be really critical.
Cool. So the big question comes of what is virtual production? And this is my observation about it, is that it's not one thing in particular. A lot of people confuse it with being the LED wall and has to all end up over there. But virtual production is really a suite of tools that help you blend the real with the virtual. And that's really the essence of it. And the tools allow you to have an iterative, non-destructive process from start to finish in a way. So you have multiple people who participate. What you're seeing over here is an environment that was built for Fathead. It's called the Ragamuffin Camp. And the process of arriving to that point required a lot of people to come together. And so right from the beginning, from storyboards, which Nan did, who's here, all the way to getting to this final pixel, as we call it, that Happy Mushroom did for us, everything led to another, building on each other. So, and we could anyway, at any point, literally roll back as needed. And the other thing is also to create, as we see over here, photoreal real-time worlds that we can play on the LED wall or in any other medium. If we were doing green screen composure still, be able to use those things. And in-camera visual effects is where we would need the LED wall, where we're actually trying to capture a final image in camera. And so we'll take it from there.
All right, so for a frame of reference to establish a baseline of what probably everyone here is familiar with is that traditional film pipeline between pre-production, production, and post, having that fluid sort of, maybe you have one team or a certain different label that you give to another team, but the fluidity or the process is the same or relatively the same across it. And what's different is that in a traditional pipeline, you've got a couple of elements here that you wouldn't have in virtual production, such as the location and construction, as well as where you're going to intersect with your VFX vendor and how early you pull them in changes. So this shows you a difference between what happens in a virtual production pipeline, which is that, as you can see here, you've got previs, which is now, even though it can be a part of the current pipeline, it's essential. You will not be successful doing a virtual production if you do not hit your previs and hit it hard. Also, you pull in working with your VFX vendor. A lot of people hire that on, post after you've done all these shots, but you're actually pulling them on early on and in the beginning stages of the project in order to blend up what your different environments are and what assets that you need in tracking them. The other aspects are that the virtual art department, which we call the VAD, that's a team that didn't exist before. As well as instead of a live action shoot, I mean, technically it is still a live action shoot, but you're gonna be doing it on an LED volume stage. One other aspect is sort of post, how in post, because you're doing in-camera VFX, your post becomes a really minimized aspect of the pipeline, and or the goal is that you're shooting as close to final pixel as possible. Whereas again, going back to that sort of traditional pipeline, you would normally have a ton of clipping and adding a VFX all on the back end, but instead in virtual production, that's all moved into the front end of the film. To give you an idea of our setup at Fathead, we had our lovely colleague and amazing superhuman Estella Che. She did some illustrations for us because of NDAs. As we said, those cloak and dagger things, they still exist. She did a drawing for us to be able to explain to you what the setup was that we had at Fathead, which is that we had a network set of clusters of machines that were remotely controlled by KVM switches by the VAD team. You had the camera tracking department, which is using that tracking mechanism on the top of the camera to control the frustum, which your frustum is that window of what's being shot. And that feeds into Unreal via a plugin. The digital imaging technician and the data management are responsible for working with the director of photography to make sure that everything that's being captured, they control the camera, they vet out and are a second set of eyes on whether we're hitting the visual integrity and the initial vision around what we wanted the film to be, as well as another set of eyes in, is anything blocking, is something out of the way, is there something that we missed or something that isn't continuous? And then, of course, sound. Poor sound. The sound guys, Eric's here today, they just always have to be on. They always have to be ready. I think they must have a very stressful job because we spend a lot of time chatting about these other departments and teams, but sound, it's they're just always ready to go. So you can see there's that LED wall in the background, and there's kind of this blend between the traditional production design physical assets, as well as that background wall. And then all those little blocks on top are an AppD-Track system that is, literally all of that is just there to know where the camera is. And the point of all this in terms of what we reference with the pipeline and how we bring these things together is about staying truer to the vision. A lot of directors will just be involved in that initial phase, and or teams are siloed. I kind of think of it like the grain, the grains that you get at the grocery store. Instead of oh, the nuts are here and the raisins are here and the dried mangoes here. We're really looking for more of a trail mix type of approach in terms of virtual production, in which your environment teams and your asset teams and your physical and digital assets, you're all checking those as you go along the process and all up front before you ever get to the shoot day.
Cool. So because I'm from India, I use this reference of the three monkeys. And the whole idea is when we have a large team of folks with creative sensibilities come together, a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what the film should be, and there can only be one film. So right from the start, you want to get people to express what they have in their mind in a way that is communicated to the others clearly as possible. So that's what some of these suite of tools really allow us to do, is to bring all these teams together and put what's in their mind in a way that is actually visible to us in using tools like Unreal Engine, all the other kind of 3D DCC packages like Maya and Houdini or whatever you use. And you bring it all together so that it's no longer in somebody's head, and it's a great film in somebody's head, but that never gets made. So right from the beginning, whether it's producers, creatives, they're all able to show, point, walk into the environment. There's something called virtual scouting. You actually literally get to wear VR headsets, get into the environment, and get a feel for it, and start to move things around, interact with the environment, look at your shots through the camera, a virtual camera, so that's the VCam session, and you're beginning to see your picture rather than imagine what it's going to be if it all comes together perfectly. So you take all the guesswork out, and I think film is a risky business as is. So being able to see as much of what you're going to get early on is only going to help everyone sleep better and get a better picture made in the end. And yeah, so this is one of those things. So we had a previs for this shot, for example, and that came together with a number of steps going all the way from script to storyboard to doing something called as gray boxing, which is just very basic gray images of, you know, geometry and stick figures walking around in a 3D world, though. But you block your shots, and then from there on, you start building up your assets till you get to some point like this. And now when you get on the set, you're not guessing what you're going to get as you finish frame. You know what you're targeting. You're only going to get better from there.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, you know, when I showed y'all that traditional pipeline to what it is in a virtual production environment, this really highlights the difference when you're looking at previs, is that in a traditional film pipeline, you know, you've got storyboards and you've got these different assets that are all sort of clipped together, but in terms of when you approach virtual production, it's much more like an animation pipeline, where instead of this sort of meandering, never is, oh, maybe we like this shot, or oh, we like this shot, you're actually planning everything out, and you're placing, you know, both characters and doing these simulated animations so that you actually have a very detailed idea before you ever show up on set as to what your shots are and where your digital and virtual assets are going to blend.
So that's the point over there, is to get onto the same page. And the sooner we get there, the more we can be creative with it, the more confident we can be with the process. And this is something that helps even lesser-known filmmakers to be able to present something more than just a screenplay or a pitch presentation. And if you're able to get an edit out of it, show the kind of film you want to make, you're going to get executives and financiers be more interested in the project. And it's also true for people who may be well-known with a past record of hits behind them, but every project is a risk. So with bigger budgets, it becomes even more necessary to exactly know where you're putting all that millions of dollars. And yeah, so the suite of tools is really more advantageous than, and it can be used across any kind of film. It doesn't have to end up on an LED wall. These techniques can be used for regular films that go on real locations or anywhere as well. I think transparency and knowledge really helps make us all better filmmakers.
Absolutely. And on that transparency, we wanted to give a nod to one, again, I think Nan is here, and he did, I forget, how many storyboards for?
Close to 1,000.
Yeah, so what's really neat about virtual production, as Tom mentioned, was this non-destructive asset, and/or what can be really challenging for creatives is that you're like, oh, you'll get further along and you're like, I've made this idea, I've made this decision, oh yeah, we're here. And then suddenly you look at it one day and you're like, how did we get here? And so with virtual production, you know, you're following by creating this previs documentation and all of these really thorough elements of bringing together the digital and physical assets, is that it is, we found, at least in the Fathead production, that we had more shots, or you have a higher hit rate of shots that were in your storyboards and that you do end up shooting, because you work through the previs process. So this is an example of some of our previs elements, where they went from storyboards into that sort of, just really low res render environment so that you get an idea of, where the character are or what might be, say, stunt viz, and then moving from there to the actual shots.
Cool. So these are just some of the tools. We had several tools we used, but then these are some of the tools that were very essential to what we ended up with. So Fifth Kind is a platform that allowed us to really manage the hundreds of thousands of assets that were created at every stage and be able to have ways to identify who was contributing what and not lose any of those valuable inputs that were coming from all of our contributors at any stage. POFOS was the environment in which we were able to, it's called version control, change control. So that's what integrates with Unreal. And we have one central project which sits in the cloud that everybody gets to access. So we make copies of it on our individual machines, and whatever changes we make, we're able to put back into the main folder at the depot, as they call it. But if anything seems to be not agreeable to others, we're able to roll back to any version. And so there's that security in what you're doing when you have hundreds of people working on the same project. And of course, AWS with the cloud, which gave us the security we needed and to store all the information that we have at any stage. Slack was very essential in the communication between these hundreds of people, partners, collaborators, creatives. Airtable is where Ben Baker, executive producer, laboriously coached us all to interact and create this entire library of metadata about the assets that we had from so many different libraries, assets we created, all the different steps that we went around. The director was able to enter notes into it. So this is a vision of what happened in Airtable, for example. And without it, of course, we'd be lost, because with these meetings that you have, and you have so much input coming from everywhere, and you're moving from meeting to meeting, a month later, you'd have forgotten everything. So having all of these tools together is what helped us. So we'll just look, you can carry on and then slide into the other ones. So that was Airtable, this is Fifth Kind. And you can see almost every department, anything that was ever done in any department has been stored, and any references we wanted. And on this project, this was very critical because we did go through several script revisions, because there were, like with any production, I think there are many challenges, whether they're budget challenges, availability challenges, location challenges, all kinds of things. And you have to work around it. So in our script revisions, we literally had to rewrite some of the key scenes towards the end of the film. And in doing that, we were able to conveniently go back and forth to identify the essence of the picture that we were going for, and always know that all of those inputs were contributing toward the final script that we went ahead and produced.
Yeah, on a quick note about that, again, kind of going back to that pipeline that I showed y'all earlier, when you look at the tools in the pipeline, what was huge also about Fifth Kind is that having this, it's like a live Dropbox or a more efficient way of Dropbox, but one of the key learnings that came out of this was, hey, like there are roles and departments that don't exist now that are going to exist in this environment, and one of the things that came out of this was that there was this sort of constant back and forth and a lot of confusion and or just double and triple checking things between the production design crew and the virtual art department, because the virtual art department's working on the wall and production's working on set. And so one of the key jobs that kind of came out was this idea of having a data wrangler, or someone that was sort of dotted line to both orgs in order to better connect them and be able to better manage these assets. And that way just to be more prepared and understand things like square footage and how many props that you need and what your blending aspect ratios are, as well as one of the other key things that we'll start to see out of game engines is this ability to, the same way that physics rendering and things like that became an issue, or has become awesome, rather, I should say, not an issue. Not enough sleep. But the other aspect is that, being able to set that distance of like where depth is believable. We all go back to art school and it's like you've got that 2-point line. Well, that is times 100 in a virtual production environment. There we go. Sorry about that. All right. And then here's Perforce. Just wanted to be able to show y'all. I know this might seem a bit geeky, but these tools are so critical in the prep phase and just for organizing assets. I think we've seen a lot of software vendors that are approaching this. Adobe's got their incredible cloud aspect, but what's sort of a unique thing about, I think, a pain point that we saw in the industry, and one of these things that we think has to be addressed by tech in the future, is that when everybody's got their own individual cloud and their own individual process to asset management, the reality is that you're using multiple different ISV vendors in order to create your content. So you still need some sort of a cohesive system of where to store everything and then how to find it, because the logic of how I name a file might be completely different to how Tom might name a file.
And we also had multiple vendors when it came to VAD as well. So because we had 3 environments, so we had people at Rochester Institute of Technology help us with one of those environments. UME.ai helped us with another environment. And then we had a third environment that Scott Squires, who was our VP supervisor, was working on. And eventually we got Happy Mushroom come on board to bring all of these environments to Final Pixel. So we could have individual streams that didn't kind of in a way interact with the other ones. So each of these vendors could have their own individual environment in which they were able to operate once the handoff was happening. So anything pre-handoff, we had a whole library of all the changes that took place, and post-handoff, we had a whole journey from there.
To say, and all that's to say is that we're telling you all these great tools, and it's all going to change. Virtual production is a bleeding edge area. I think also computing and how we consume content, I think we could probably all agree, is a shifting paradigm between spatial computing, interactive content, that ability to feel closer to something as you consume it, but also, like I said, critically in my area where my team focuses on the creation aspect is, how does that feel tangible? How do I have an idea of like touching or feeling, or that, hey mom, look at this type of thing, both as myself as a creative and across different teams. And then as well as like how we realize these environments. So, things like network systems, CPUs, GPUs, edge computing, how these things are architected, down to the software applications. There's a couple of call to action items. One is that, again, these all need to evolve, but 2 is that a critical call to action is the ability for these companies to take more of that interoperability or this frenemies type of approach in order to make it easier for the end users and for the teams that are trying to put all of this together.
Cool. So again, I wanted to reiterate the point of virtual production to be approached as a dynamic toolbox, and for folks to use that and understand that there's no production that can, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for any production. So going from production to production, you just have to figure out which way you want to fix this puzzle so that it works best for you. But the tools exist, we just have to work with them. And a lot of those have been borrowed from other fields, like the game engine itself comes from game development. These LED screens that you see come from displays for concerts and other things. So while they're all available, I think we're all intelligent and creative enough to figure out what we need to make the things work, and that's the whole idea with that. And the whole idea of show, don't tell, the idea that you can bring everybody on the same page early on and bring what's in your mind and from a concept to something that everybody can agree on very early in the process. And the VP tools are all mix and match. You have to pick what works best for you. There's no I can't take exactly what we did on Fathead and apply it to another film. The learnings and the foundation exist. You just have to figure out now what combination is going to work for something else. And by doing this, by being able to communicate very early in the pipeline, you compress the timelines heavily. You're able to see what's in the frame, and the sooner you get to see what's in the frame and everyone can agree on it, I think all our creative efforts, all our time, money, resources can go towards making that frame the best frame it can be. So that's what VP really helps us do. I think it's an empowering tool.
Absolutely. And a beautiful way to end that is that while, virtual production, we've heard a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm so excited about virtual, I want to shoot something in virtual production. We just want to temper a little bit of that enthusiasm and that don't do technology for technology's sake. There's some media, absolutely, that is not best suited for virtual production. So you want to vet out what it is that you're trying to do. Tom had this wonderful quote that when we were, kicking ideas back and forth one day about how, you have to ask yourself the question of, is it necessary to shoot in virtual production? If it is an existing site, why aren't you shooting there? Is it a museum? Is it a hazardous area? Is it going to be expensive or difficult to get the crew there? Is it that it has to be at golden hour? And guess what? Golden hour is only for an hour. So aspects of that is really, really helpful when you look at virtual production techniques. So. And a quick nod, just want to say thank you again to Estella Che. She's been a huge aspect of my partner in crime in terms of the research on this project, and she is a phenomenal, internationally known VR creative technologist, and I just really wanted to give her a quick shout out, as well as a huge thank you to ETC for continuing to do the work that they do that allows us to actually have a playground for connecting and discussing what sort of future we should build. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. So we can take a few questions. We have 8 minutes and 44 seconds on there.
We must have done a really awesome job.
Looks like it.
All right, well then I'm gonna have a shameless plug.
What would you say is an application that wouldn't do well for virtual production?
If you've seen like the follow-arounds, when you think about virtual production, Tom had this great example about, I forget the name of the film, but how like you can use a treadmill, for motion. But when you're following people like through a particular route, or say that you need that depth of field of interaction between foreground and background elements, that's going to be limited in a virtual production environment because you've only got this, as this line is right here, right? You've got this element where your stage is this. So it's like anything where you're needing to run a lot, really intensive stunt viz, things like that, or not stunt viz, but stunts, they can be done. It depends on how long of a sequence, like how far is the character traveling. Other aspects that we've seen have been with the difference between, and this is really bleeding edge new, but there's a lot of discussion around, as Tom discussed, how it's really, and he's an amazing producer, so the crunching of the creative timelines, what allows for that is that it's really well suited to episodic content. You tend to have like more character driven, maybe a little bit less VFX heavy type of things with episodic content, and then as well as the aspect of like having that crunch timeline. But feature films, you have like such a variety of locations and such a diverse elements of like where the actors are going. There might be elements of it that are great for virtual production, but not necessarily the whole film. And Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. So you go from can you hear me now? Okay, cool. So it kind of goes from scene to scene and project to project. The decision making will be based on budget, number one, for producers from that standpoint. If you can achieve the same thing with greater realism and more suitable budgets in a real location, you'd just go do that, right? I mean, but at the same time, if you're doing a show like Westworld or what you saw with The Mandalorian, those worlds don't even exist. So you would have to heavily rely on visual effects for that anyways. So those kind of worlds really are well suited for something like this. And you can achieve a lot with that and work very fast with it. And anything that already exists in real worlds, she gave a mention of, say, a museum, for example. I have to go shoot at the Louvre. Now, just to go shoot there for 3 days or 4 days, it's going to cost a ton of money. You have to block the whole thing, have to pay the museum huge costs. The insurance just runs up because you're around these very expensive artwork. So you go create a digital double of that entire environment, and now you got the thing available to you, and you can shoot as much as you want on a wall and achieve the same things. So those are the kind of things you'll choose to make decisions with. Any more questions?
I just wanted to ask if you guys had come across digital humans in this workspace at all.
So what you saw on the wall over there was the Ragamuffin camp, and the director's vision for that environment was to have about 100 ragamuffins just populating the space and running around and interacting with the action that was going to happen on the stage between live actors. So we did use a number of different techniques to achieve that. So by the time we got into this production, we had metahumans within Unreal Engine, so we used metahumans. We also wanted some of the digital actors to look closer to the actors on stage. So we had our costume designer, Maddie Mays, design a number of clothes for the extras, and then we had the kids dressed in those. We went to Scan Truck. We scanned these kids using 210 cameras, created a digital double, so to speak, and then rigged them, and were able to capture motion data from Noitum, which does perception neuron suits and gloves, and also using a suitless, markerless motion capture system called Move.ai, which is from London, and so we were able to use that as well. So we used those motion capture data to animate these characters, bring them on stage. We also used blueprints within Unreal Engine to time how those animations played on stage, gave them triggers so that there was an assistant director who could actually trigger them to have actions coincide with the actions of the actors on stage, reacting to the scenes as these scenes were happening. And the director would basically have number of takes happen. He would reset and take, to the next one. The next one, we were working with kids, so we couldn't just break and then regroup and come back. So once the kids were at a certain level, he just wanted to go before he called cut. So it was easy for us to roll back to whatever point the animation was at and go back. So we had a number of techniques involved in that, sure.
Can you explain more about the motion capture system that you were using?
A little more about the motion capture system. Perception neuron is a more traditional one, which uses markers, in this case, which are being tracked by sensors, and you basically apply it to a rig. In this case, we were applying it to the rig of the metahumans within Unreal Engine. And there's some degree of cleanup that's needed for that, and then you bring it all together. So you take one action at a time, and then you're able to stitch it together to create a continuous action out of it. With the Move.ai system, for example, those used regular action cameras. So we had 8 action cameras in a circular arrangement, and then it would give us a workable area in the middle, and that's the performance stage in which we could have anywhere between 1 to 5 actors perform. And the director was involved in directing them, so the action is exactly how he would have directed a group of extras with his first AD. And so we captured all of that data. The whole thing is that it's with us now and to use on the day, whichever way we want, in whichever order, and also increase the number of extras in the background. Initially, we had trepidation about the number of characters we could put on stage, but the stage where we shot at, we could have about 100 metahumans very good, no problem.
And did that answer your question as far as, were you asking about the motion tracking for metahumans or the motion tracking for the camera?
I was talking about the hardware, and you said that there's a limit to the number of mannequins. Is that because of performance in Unreal? You said there was a limit to the number of mannequins you could have. Was that as a result of performance in Unreal?
I didn't hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was talking about the number of mannequins that you said you could have. Was that related to the performance in Unreal?
Yeah, it's related to the performance of your GPU per se, or the whole compute power that you have. So stage to stage, it could differ. The moment you run your environment, your project through end display, it's basically splitting it and applying it to different nodes, and it requires a lot of compute power. So it's really a product of that. But most of these stages that are high powered right now, they have not only just one set of computing systems to run thing, they have a backup server also standing by with a stream in case one goes down. They're able to switch very easily using context switching. But it is heavily dependent on compute power.
To give a
So I
little
think-
extra context to that, so in terms of like a lot of these typical systems, the way that they're setting up, and that's why we talked about how technology is continuing to change, is their ability for how these network systems are architected. But as it stands right now, like a lot of stages, as Tom mentioned, you'll have like clusters. You'll have your server room, and you've got a cluster of network systems. And then across the VAD team, you'll have there's kind of 2 ways in which they approach it. They tend to have multiple control machines for either cluster, and then you can use any one of those machines to control one or both clusters. So in a lot of these circumstances, like they design, you kind of, I mean, and this is where between film and game it's difficult because game engines are designed to have like the lowest fidelity but still be visually representative, so that you have, not expensive resources, whereas film's the opposite. It's like I want the highest resolution that I possibly can. And so that's why they're doing a lot of these systems where it's like, well, depending on the intensity of that particular scene, you can join both clusters together to use the entire compute power of that. And then as far as the camera tracking, I can hit you offline if you wanted to hear more about that. The camera tracking, we were using military-grade KVM switches. Yeah, a lot of technology innovation, right? You're using something that's like, hey, this wasn't designed for this, but this solves our problem, so we're just gonna put that on there.
So that's time, and thank you for being a great audience and asking wonderful questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.